Hello and welcome to my FlossTube channel. I'm Jean Farish and I am once again glad that you're here with me today. Last week I talked a little bit about some of the challenges of stitching with and living with over-dyed flosses, and then that led to a little bit of comments and whatnot about over-dyed fabrics as well. And I said that I would talk about it more extensively this week, and you know what it's like when you make plans like that. They don't always come out the way you wanted them to. So it is a project I'm still working on, and I am hoping that next week I'll be able to bring everything together. Basically, I'm testing a variety of threads in a wide range of methods to figure out how to make overdyes color fast if possible. So that's what I've been working on, and I really thought I was going to have it all together by today, but that didn't happen. So I thought then that maybe what we would do today is go on the other end of the color spectrum and talk about white work. We use the term white work as a general descriptor of work that's basically tone on tone. In its most traditional sense, it is stitched on white fabric with white thread. But it can also be ecru on ecru, or tan on tan, or even black on black. The key is to stitch with a thread that is so close to the color of the ground cloth that the threads and the stitches themselves are almost invisible. So you might be asking yourself, then what is it that you see? And basically what you end up seeing is a play of light and shadow on the work itself. So the stitching is either done in such a way that you're rearranging the threads of the ground cloth, like in pulled thread or drawn thread work, or you're stitching in such a way that you're creating a padding that in itself creates a texture that then produces this play of light and shadow. So that's the why of stitching with the same color thread as the fabric that you're stitching on. It's not a design technique that appeals to everyone. It is usually a very traditional design elements that you see in white work, but that doesn't mean that it isn't open to many more possibilities and a more modern interpretation. So if this inspires you in terms of the technique, but you are not inspired by the design elements themselves, I encourage you to experiment and take this whole thing to another level. A few weeks ago, when I was trying to define or come up with a definition of the term embroidery, I mentioned white work as a category. And within that category of a type of embroidery, I named a couple of them: hardanger, Ruskin lace, cut work, pulled thread, drawn thread, Mount Melick, Hedabo, reticella, schwalm. Many of these embroidery techniques are very tied in with history and very tied in with different regions of the world. So it's not unusual for a region to develop kind of a signature white work technique and to become known for it. And then that name gets attached to the technique, and the next thing you know, a person is doing schwalm work, which has its roots in Germany, anywhere else in the world, yet it still retains that name. Most of the design work I have done incorporates a little bit of white work with the colorful techniques of cross stitch. But the first thing I want to show you today, though, is a white work tablecloth that I bought many, many years ago in an antique shop. And this is a tablecloth that's, I haven't measured it, but I want to say it's about 4 feet square. It's a pretty good size. So let me show you the white work technique that's done in 3 rows around the edge of this tablecloth. Now I want to get in really close here if I can. So in this corner, we have a area that the threads have been withdrawn, and so therefore it's called drawn thread work. And that is done in each of these 3 inner borders. This one also forms the hem of the tablecloth. Now keep in mind that each of these borders go around the entire perimeter of the tablecloth, so it's a massive amount of work. So let me see if I can try to explain what's happening here. So in this area, the threads that were woven in this direction have been taken out, and the threads that were woven in this direction are left in. And then these designs are created by weaving in and out from the threads that are left. I'm trying to pull on this to straighten it out some so you can get more of an idea of how intricate this is. So again, the threads that are going this way are part of the ground cloth. This thread that's woven, and then let me see if I can come in even closer here. That's the stitch is taken around a couple of the threads, kind of gathering these threads together, and then come down here, and then this is like a spider web stitch, and then it goes on and on, and so that's what's creating this design. And then also here in the corner. Now down this way, the opposite threads were taken out. So again, the threads going this way were withdrawn. The threads this way were left in. And that's why along here on the edges, there's a very fine stitching to keep it from unraveling. And then this cross design is woven between the threads that are left in place. And then here, a different design, same idea, but in this corner, a different design is put into place. So again, you can see where, again, the threads this way were withdrawn, and the rather coarse threads you see going this way are the ones that were left in place. So this is one technique of white work. Very often you'll hear the term pulled and drawn thread as if it's one technique, but it's actually 2. Pulled thread means that you're taking stitches in such a way that you are pulling the ground cloth threads and creating a different pattern among the threads. You're not taking any threads out. Drawn thread, think of the word withdraw. You're actually removing threads and cutting them away or taking them out and reweaving them in some way to create an open border like you have on this tablecloth. So you know, it's you know, and I don't know about you, but the first thing I think of when I see a piece like this, I think, how did anybody ever have the patience to do that kind of work? I don't know the age of this piece. I wish I did. But when I think about it being made, say, 100 years ago or more, and you think of the typical life of a woman running a household, most of what she's doing during the day is incredibly active, and it was rare to get a chance just to sit down and do mending or to weave or do spinning. And so this type of work would be incredibly relaxing. Today, it seems that we go from like project to project and we're rushing through and we can't wait to get done, and we have many projects stacked up waiting for them. But think in terms of someone having limited time and limited means, and how important it would be to take this precious piece of fabric and create something exquisite from it just with your time and your ability with a needle. So it's just a completely different way of life that I think sometimes is really hard for us to imagine ourselves in that place. But I want you to think about the needlework project you enjoy the most. And imagine for just a moment if that was the only piece of fabric you were going to have and the only basket of threads you were going to have for the next year. Would you take more time with it? Would you work in a more exquisite way? Would you try stitches that right now seem unimaginable to you, so that you would be totally creating something from nothing? So just something to think about. Not all white work is pulled and drawn thread work. This is a portion of my Melbourne Sampler, and this area across the top was a very traditional design. Whether you think of it in terms of a star or a snowflake or whatever, it is simply a satin stitch that you still can see it, even though it's color on color, it's white on white, and you can still see the design, again, because of the light and shadow on it. Now, I have put this on kind of a neutral background. This piece right now is unframed, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So let me show you what it looks like if I put it on a darker background. You can see even more clearly. You can see the stitches, and there's more contrast. So in this particular class piece, which I'm going to be teaching soon, and I'm hoping to give you some details about that in the next week or so. So we're doing a pulled thread stitch here, which is a very traditional four-sided stitch, doing a tone on tone with a satin stitch. And then in this area, again, with drawing threads. And unlike the tablecloth that I showed you, because it's going to be framed, I actually teach the technique of where you can reweave the edges without sewing them to keep it from unraveling. And so this has a little bit of hem stitch, and it has one of the decorative stitches that's done with the threads. Again, the threads that were woven this way were withdrawn. The threads that you see in this design right here are the same threads that were woven and just left in place. And then down here, we have a pulled thread stitch, which I'm going to teach you in just a few moments. So this particular piece I brought out to show you that white work can include many different techniques in the same project. This piece is also an opportunity to talk again about that whole idea of designing and stitching and whatnot. I'm going to be restitching this one for a couple of reasons. Some of them were pretty minor, and I could, if it was just the one thing by itself, I could fix it. But like years after the fact, I'm finally noticing that I made a mistake here in stitching the letter T. There's an extra stitch right there. And again, if that's the only thing I had to fix, that would be easy. I'm going to also make some just design changes. I am going to substitute this number 8 pearl cotton for 2 strands of floss and still get the same effect of this kind of padded satin stitch. And but the main reason I'm tackling this kind of all over again is because of this row right here. I love this thread. This is Water Lilies, which is a hand-painted silk thread by Karen Collection, and it's one of my favorites. I've loved it for years and years and years and years and years. But one of the frustrations from the design and production side of this is that the color, the dye lots can change so much. And what I did in this case was I matched my floss colors to this dye lot. And then when the dye lot's different the next time, and sometimes it's radically different, then the threads don't match anymore. And so I'm kind of shying away from it for that reason. So this row is going to be redone. And yeah, so and that means these rows need to be redone. And again, I love the look of it. And if I could always know that that's what I was going to get when I ordered that colorway in the water lilies, then I would keep on using it. And so, of course, since I'm going to be restitching it, then I'm going to be using Cosmo thread instead of DMC. Was really hoping to find one of the Cosmo variegateds that would work in place of this row, but I just didn't come up with one. So I'll figure out something I think that's going to be just as pretty. Obviously, I mean, I'm not going to go to all that work and have it not be as pretty. So again, this is the Melbourne Sampler, and one that I hope to be teaching before the end of this year, before the end of 2021. And of course, one of the other things I'll be doing as I'm restitching it is making video tutorials to go along with it, so that when I do teach a class, my students will also have links to those videos to assist them once they get back home. I know what it's like to be in a class when you're learning a huge body of material, and even when you have good stitch diagrams and you might even take notes as you're working. Once you get home, it's just, it's like all bets are off. It's like, wait a minute, what did she mean here? And what was I supposed to do there? And so I think the video tutorials come in handy in that way. So what I'm going to focus on now is to give you a couple of tutorials on how to do some of these pulled thread stitches, and to use them to illustrate some of the basic principles of pulled thread work. So let me start there and just go over just some general ideas of when you're doing pulled thread work, some of the things that you need to keep in mind. The first one that always takes some getting used to, and you kind of have to get your head wrapped around, is any diagram that has the stitch shown either upright or exactly sideways. Once it's pulled, that stitch will be slanted. If it's diagrammed on the slant, once it's pulled, it's going to get straightened up. So very often, the picture of what you're going to be stitching and the diagram don't seem to match at all. And very often students will have that very perplexed, almost deer in headlights look, where they are wondering if some diagrams didn't get swapped out somehow because what they're stitching and the diagram don't seem to match. But again, if it's diagrammed straight up and down, when you pull it, it's going to slant. If it's diagrammed on the slant, once you pull it, it's going to straighten up and down. So that's one of the things I think that makes pulled thread work a little bit more of a challenge. The next thing is that when you do pulled thread work, how hard you pull can vary from stitch to stitch, and even within the same stitch, within one project and another, the design may call for a different degree of it being pulled. You can pull it next to nothing, and you can pull it radically hard, and everything in between. And this is one of the reasons why I encourage people when they're learning pulled thread work to use a practice cloth until they can get their tension the same in all their stitches, because the consistency is what makes for the pretty stitches. And one of the other things too that I think is a challenge for new stitchers that are trying pulled thread work for the first time is where to anchor your threads, both at the beginning and the end. Because one of the things you don't want to do is to interrupt the laciness that you've worked so hard to create. And so as you're pulling these stitches and you're creating, kind of making holes in the linen, not holes that are caused by threads being cut, but holes being caused by threads being pulled apart, then when you go to anchor your thread, you don't want to carry that traveling thread across those nice lacy holes. Otherwise, it just interrupts that play of light and shadow. So today I'm going to show you 3 different pulled thread stitches that are kind of related to each other. The first one is the waffle stitch. And in this case, I'm going to be stitching it 4 threads high and 4 threads wide. Now, it can be done in other configurations, but that's just the way I'm going to do it today. This one is diagrammed with each one of the stitches going straight up and down or sideways. So from here, I'm going to go count up 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to start by just poking and pulling, and then I'm going to do it in a sewing motion. And then from there, I'm coming over to the left 4 threads. And now I'm going to come straight down 4 threads. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I can do this in a sewing motion. I can make sure that I've got 4 threads on my needle and pull it like that. Now I'm not pulling it all. I just said I'm pulling it, but I just meant pulling it through. So now 1, 2, 3, 4, and scoop up under 4. So at this point, that's how it looks when it's diagrammed. You're going straight up 4, under 4, down 4, under 4, back and forth like that. But what happens when you start pulling it? So if I come back here and just pull under this with my needle, see how that stitch now is slanted? And now if I pull this one, and then pull this one, see how it changes already. And when I talked about it creating holes, this is what I meant. No threads have been cut, but it's creating a hole. So let me make a few more. Now this is a stitch that if in stitching it in a project, I would call for it to be pulled fairly hard. So I want to pull this as I'm stitching it. So there's 1, and I can pull it in both directions, going up and down. So now I'm going to come up 4 and scoot under 4. And again, you can see how different it looks than when I was not pulling it. So coming down 4, under 4, and pulling. Now I'm not going to make a very long row here. Now the thread that I'm stitching with here is a linen thread. When you're stitching pulled thread, if you're going to use floss, you need to use at least 2 strands. I shouldn't say at least 2 strands. I would use 2 strands. Or you can use a number 12 pearl cotton, or like I say, this linen thread. 1 strand of floss by itself is not going to be strong enough. It'll end up breaking. Now the end of this row, I'm going to end up by coming up the 4 threads. Now this is not meant to be a complete lesson on everything you need to know about pulled thread, but more of an introduction. Now the next row, I'm going to turn my work 180 degrees. So now it's upside down. And now I'm going to stitch exactly the same as what I just stitched. And so I'm sharing a hole here. I'm coming under the same 4 threads that I came under before. Now over here on the edge, I can't pull it very hard. Not until I get going again. So from here, I'm coming up 4 threads, scooping under 4. And these are new threads that I'm scooping under. And I'm pulling away. And then I'm going to come down here, and this is easy because I'm coming in my 2 shared holes. Don't even have to count. And now I'm pulling down this way. Then I come up 4, scoop under 4. Oops. Under 4. And so you're beginning to see how different the pattern looks with multiple rows. So that's the other thing too that can throw a novice stitcher, is that it doesn't look like much when you do just a couple of stitches, and it doesn't look like much even when you do 1 row. It's the multiple rows that gives you the full effect. So that gives you just a little taste of the waffle stitch, and it's probably one of the most basic whitework stitches. Now, the stitch I like to teach kind of back to back to this one is the wave stitch. because it's diagrammed to look like the waffle, but because the stitches are diagrammed on an angle, when you pull them, they straighten up, and so they look very different. So let's take a look at the wave stitch next. I'm going to put this one right underneath the one that we were just stitching so you can really see the contrast. Now this one, we're also going to stitch in a combination of 4x4, except I'm going to start over here 2 threads in, and my first stitch is going to be 4 threads high, so 2, 3, 4, but I'm going to scoot back over here 2 threads, so I'm still picking up 4 threads with my needle. Now I'm not going to pull the first one just like I did with the other demonstration. So I'm going to come into this shared hole and come under these 4 threads. Whoops. Okay, again, I'm not pulling at this point. And now I'm going to come into this shared hole and scoop up 4 threads. So what happens when I do start pulling? When I pull this and pull this one, you can see that the threads start straightening up. Now I'm going to come up here and scoop up 4 threads and pull. So you can see where, I mean, it's not perfectly straight up and down, but you can see where even though I'm stitching it on an angle, when I pull it, it straightens up. Okay, I'm going to end right here. And after I get this first stitch established, I'm going to turn it upside down again, just as I did the other row. So once I turn it around, then I'm basically doing the same needle motion and pulling hard with each stitch. Coming under 4, pulling, coming under 4, pulling. When I do this type of simple white work, it's really easy to understand how a person can do just miles and miles of white work because it's so relaxing. You really get into just kind of repetitive motion, and it's almost meditative. So let me finish this last little bit, and then we can really compare the two stitches side by side, or one on top of the other. Okay. So again, Both of these stitches are done so that each stitch is taking over 4 threads and then under 4 threads. And yet look how different they look from each other, simply because of the pattern that is made as you're stitching. So again, I mean, I'm not, my intention today is not to show you everything as far as how to bury threads and whatnot, but just to give you kind of a taste of how different stitches can look, even though they seem so similar in terms of their diagram, but also that whole idea of getting your head wrapped around how a stitch that, again, that's diagrammed straight up and down will end up being slanted when you pull it. And when it's diagrammed on a slant, when you pull it, it gets straightened up. And I think once a novice can kind of get their head wrapped around that the diagram doesn't always look exactly like the stitched piece, then that's a huge step. And now for my final tutorial today, I want to show you a little sampler. Again, it has a combination of pulled and drawn thread work in it. And to point out this stitch right here. Now this is under glass, so I don't know how well you're going to be able to see it. And if it doesn't videotape well, then I'll go back and find one of my still photos from before I had this framed. Because what I want to show you here is this pretty little stitch right here. Okay, that's working out pretty well, I think. This is that same wave stitch, but done in a different pattern to create these little window pane motifs. So let me show you how that's done with kind of a cousin stitch to the wave stitch. Okay, this time my stitches are going to be 5 threads high. So I'm coming down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and over 2. And I'm going to scoop up 5 threads this time instead of 4. Make sure I've got 5 on there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then up here, instead of coming in a shared hole like I did up here, I'm going to skip a thread and scoop under 5 threads again. So 2, 4, 5. And now I can pull kind of hard. Down here, I'm going to skip, before I was coming in a shared hole, but instead I'm going to skip a thread and then come in here and scoop up 5 again. And pull. Not going to come in a shared hole. I'm skipping a thread, scooping up 5. And this only works if you're doing an odd number of threads. Skipping that thread and scooping up 5. All right, this is going to work now. And then I'm going to end right here. And down here, I'm going to be in line with this stitch right here, but I want to skip this thread and come up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 threads to begin my next row. So again, this one's going to come over 2 and up 5. So 2, 4, 5. And I'm skipping a thread and coming up right here. And now I can turn this around again, just as I've done previously. Skip a thread, scoop up 5. Skip a thread, scoop up 5. Skip a thread, scoop up 5. And already you can begin to see the little window panes that get created by just doing your count a little different. The needle motion's the same. You're stitching this in the same method as you did the wave stitch. But you can see how different it looks just because we're skipping one linen thread. When we did the wave stitch, everything was in a shared hole. And now we're not sharing holes. And actually that's going one thread too far, one stitch too far. So let me turn this back around, and you can really begin to see how you can get a very different look just by the count. So again, this is the wave stitch, done 4 threads high and 4 threads wide. On the window filling, which is a wave stitch variation, I've done the stitch is the same, it's just the count is different. So that's pretty much a wrap for the day, other than the fact that I do want to let you know that America Land That We Love is half price in my Etsy store this weekend until the end of the day on May 31st. So if you are inclined to stitch this as a way of honoring our nation, that opportunity is there for you. This is for a PDF version, not a printed version. And like I say, it's in my Etsy store until the end of the day on the 31st at half price. So in whatever way that you are celebrating and honoring the men and women who have made the ultimate sacrifice in our country, I hope that you have a safe and happy Memorial Day weekend. And that between now and next week when we get together, I hope you stitch happy and stay safe. I'll see you then.